The world is in terrible peril from this man, Baron Ironblood.
Heroes rise to the occasion when there's a strong villain to do battle with. And when looking at the range of Action Force toys during the 1980s, the villainous group that would be hell-bent on world domination was the maniacal Baron Ironblood and his army of Red Shadows.
They were the best bad guys that you could possibly ever get to play with as toys. That striking kind of red colour, with the black kind of tones, built into the uniforms, that was amazing.
To do justice to the tale that we want to tell here, there'll be a lot to consider. Naturally, there's the fantastic selection of action figures and vehicles made by the UK-based toy company Palitoy between 1983 and 1984.
Palitoy's Robo Skull is definitely my all-time favourite piece ever. Those toys are still loved and still sought after by collectors and even new fans.
Additionally, there's the ongoing comic series that was published by IPC magazines, which would help to market the toys, and these would breathe life into our characters while telling the story about the ongoing struggles between Action Force and the Red Shadows enemy team.
Palitoy's vision for the Action Force comic universe was very ambitious, and IPC knew that they assembled their best team to bring the Action Force comic universe to life.
All of this would add to the rich history of this European-developed group of villains that, while iconic in their home regions, would later come to be loved by fans of G.I. Joe and other similar toy lines in markets such as North America. And at the forefront of that would be a main antagonist that, for many, is every bit as important to action figure lore as the other icons created during this same era.
Baron Ironblood he's a great villain. He's completely insane. He can never, ever be reasoned with.
With that, let's have a look at the story of the Action Force enemy team. So this is the history of the Red Shadows. Let's begin.
So Palitoy, they first put out Action Force. The characters were just based on their best-selling Action Man uniforms. So there was no real kind of character names or character backstories. There was no kind of universe there, so to speak. So they set about reimagining what Action Force could be. They developed the whole concept for the 4 different teams for the good guys and developed the bad guy contingent.
Thus, the 4 teams on the heroic side would have the following breakdown. There's Z-Force, which includes the ground-based infantry troops and artillery. You've got Q-Force, the naval group, Space Force for handling threats in the Earth's orbit, and finally the SAS, a group of specially trained commandos and secret mission operatives. These teams, of course, would collectively battle against the Red Shadows, and we can have a look at the selection of offerings by Palitoy that fleshed out this enemy range. For carded figures in 1983, we got Baron Ironblood, the terrorist leader who naturally specializes in organizational military strategies. He was immediately flanked by his second-in-command, a dedicated, ruthless follower named the Black Major. The Red Shadow Trooper was the enemy infantry and would be your natural choice to be your main toy army builder. And we had the Mouton, the destructive death robots of Baron Ironblood. For vehicles, we got the Shadow Track along with its driver, the Red Vulture, and the Laser Exterminator along with Red Laser, who's a Japanese enemy scientist that specializes in laser technology. In 1984, we got the deep sea creature known as the Kraken. There's also the terrifying Skeletron, and there's the Red Jackal, a skilled vehicle operator who came packed in with the Hyena. Quite notably, we have the Red Wolf, a trained astronaut who comes with the Holy Grail, highly collectible death machine known as the Robo Skull. And finally, we have the Escape Armor, which came packed in with the Red Shadow Army Builder. You'll notice that many of these figures are of the 5 points of articulation style, similar to the Kenner vintage Star Wars toys of the late 70s through to the 80s, while some of these use the more highly articulated figure bodies and are recolors of the G.I. Joe A Real American Hero figures by Hasbro. I know I went through these pretty quickly, but that's because, for the most part, the dynamic nature of these characters would be better demonstrated by the comics. Unlike its American cousin G.I. Joe, who got both a cartoon and a comic, Action Force never did get an equivalent ongoing cartoon as a means of telling the narrative behind its heroes and villains. As such, the comic stories became that much more important for those in the UK who were fortunate enough to grow up with them.
And once they had that sort of basic kind of premise of the universe set up, they went about looking for a comics partner. And the very first partner that they spoke to was Marvel UK. Some initial concept work was done, rough cover design, some character sketches by the comics legend John Higgins. Marvel UK had assembled a team of writers and artists, and one of those writers was Alan Moore. But it didn't come to fruition. That deal with Marvel UK fell through. Marvel UK didn't have the distribution of big comics publishers like IPC magazines, and they didn't have a great track record for original content, whereas IPC did. And effectively, what IPC could bring to the table was much wider distribution and sales in the region of about 100,000 readers per week. Just by comparison, Marvel UK sales were on much lower numbers, maybe like at that time 5,000 or 6,000 a week. IPC magazines published many titles in both boys and girls comics. So when it came time to choose which title to kind of initially showcase Action Force, the decision was made to go with Battle, a war comic that IPC magazines produced. And Battle, which had been enjoying huge success throughout the 1970s, the sales were beginning to drop off throughout the 1980s. So it was seen as like a win-win type scenario. IPC felt if we bring some Action Force content to Battle, it might help boost the sales. Battle comic, like many of the comics at the time, were printed using a very cheap kind of printing process. So it was a very low grade, very lightweight paper, but also to help keep the cost down. The amount of full colour printing was limited to just the front and back cover and the centre spread, and everything else was just black and white. The intention wasn't that they would kind of be collectible items and be around for decades to come. It's a testament to the great storytelling and the great artwork that those comics are still collected to this day. While there was many writers worked on Action Force, over its lifetime, there's three principal writers, and that's Gerry Finlay-Day, James Tomlinson, and Scott Goodall. And Gerry Finlay-Day, he would have been considered, the heavyweight in the overall mix. Gerry had an amazing track record. He wrote across all kinds of genres, and he'd had hit after hit after hit, both at Battle and at IPC's sci-fi comic 2000 AD. So he really was already a comics legend by the time he came to Action Force. He brought all that great credibility with him, and he was ex-military too, so he was able to bring a lot of his own personal experience into the storytelling with Action Force. James Tomlinson was obviously a lot younger. When I got the chance to speak with James, he said that he was actually collecting and playing with the toys and working on the property at the same time, which is pretty amazing. So he was totally clued in to what was going on with the, both on the toy front and then in terms of the actual, writing of the stories. And he had a very different writing style to Gerry, so his stuff would be a bit more fantastical. And then Scott Goodall was, again, another military veteran of World War II, so he probably would have been the oldest guy working on it, and again a very experienced comics writer. So we had this brilliant writing team, but they were also backed up by an amazing team of artists. And we had, firstly Jim Watson, the first artist to produce Action Force material. He was supported by, again, legends like John Cooper, Jeff Campion, the Vanyo brothers. They led off with a kind of a small story. It was a 4-parter, 3 pages per part, which was an introductory story where Baron Ironblood and the Red Shadows, they capture Ascendancy Island and they hold it to ransom. And Action Force, the 4 teams are assembled to go in and liberate the island. In many ways, it kind of shadows or echoes the Falklands War, which had just happened a couple of years previously and was still very topical in the UK at the time. And of course, it had exactly the effect that the owners of Battle were hoping it would have, was to elevate the sales. So the sales shot up, and Action Force then became a more permanent fixture in Battle, from October 1983 onwards, where it essentially took over half the comic, and we had 3 full Action Force strips running in tandem with the World War II stories.
And within the comics, we would see the truly maniacal nature of Baron Ironblood on full display. You could tell right off the bat that he was a villain like no other.
Baron Ironblood he's a great villain. He's completely insane, but all the time he is a madman, and that makes him even more creepy and scary because he can never ever be reasoned with. When you read his backstory, which was published in one of the Action Force annuals, he's got a military background, he's a warlord, but he's also has a scientific background. He's highly educated and he's a brilliant scientist, and you see both of these elements come into play throughout the Action Force stories, in terms of how he uses or switches between these skills, whether it's developing an army of cloning an army of Kraken, or if it's invading a sovereign nation like Ascendancy Island. I think one of the craziest things that you see in terms of the Red Shadows is Baron Ironblood's training methods. So there's a story there, it's called Attack, and it opens up with a training exercise where these Red Shadow recruits are going through a series of kind of obstacles. It's kind of like the first ever version of Squid Game, because if they fail at an obstacle, the consequences are death. And of course, in Ironblood's kind of madness, this is his way of kind of weeding out the recruits who aren't really going to be up to the standards that he wants within his army. One of my favourite stories is Operation Bloodhound. SAS Force are sent on a mission to essentially capture Baron Ironblood. What they'd soon discover is that Ironblood actually has a massive network across the entire continent of South America. It's a huge network with bases all over the continent. What I love about that story is that while the SAS start off with the upper hand and they're the ones in pursuit, events slowly start to turn around. And that story, as we kind of move into the latter half of that story, Ironblood has the upper hand and he's hunting SAS, and he's actually been misleading them all along, leading them on a wild goose chase and ultimately into an area where they're trapped, and he gets to hunt them down. That leads into a whole series of events then that will ultimately drive Baron Ironblood, outside of South America and into Europe to take things to the next level. One of my favourites is the story Operation Claymore, where Baron Ironblood and his Red Shadows infiltrate a whole series of villages and towns in the Highlands in Scotland, disguised as redcoats, taking part in a commemoration pageant. Really what they're doing is they're isolating these different towns and villages, taking control of power stations, communication stations, blocking off kind of roads and bridges, and effectively what they're doing is trapping the population with a view to holding them to ransom. And that's a great story, and again, another example of some of Ironblood's crazy tactics. The Black Major and Baron Ironblood, two great characters and how they kind of interplay off each other. I've always been a big fan of how the Black Major is written. He's a really dark character, but totally obedient to Baron Ironblood, as are all the Red Shadows.
In story, the Black Major is a former Action Force member who was brainwashed into a follower of Baron Ironblood and is thus often by his side. During the comics, he was as ruthless to his own troops as he was to his Action Force opponents, and he also played a key role in the recovery of the Kraken when it was found frozen in ice at the North Pole. His figure is a recolor of the 1982 Action Force Commander as well as the 1983 Z-Force Commander, and he wasn't the only carded figure who shared parts with other items. The Red Shadow action figure also shares many parts with the 1982 German Stormtrooper. Being the usual army builder, the Red Shadows were often seen in huge numbers during the comics, working for Baron Ironblood under the empty promises of riches and power. These brainwashed followers would often shout out their intense "Blood for the Baron" battle cry when they were out in the field. Note that for the toy line, the villain group is simply known as the enemy team, and there's no mention of the Red Shadows as a faction name on the packaging itself, and it's simply the name of this infantry trooper. That said, this is different in the comics, where the Red Shadows term is used as a catch-all villain name to refer to the entirety of Baron Ironblood's ranks. And of course, the Mouton was the nearly indestructible robot that served Baron Ironblood. In the comics, Action Force would have to get pretty creative in terms of defeating these, doing things like having to freeze them with ice or leading them towards a rock slide.
Muton is another kind of classic Red Shadow character there, and at the time I wasn't aware that that character was modelled off the Deep Sea Diver. And of course, now looking back, you can clearly see that it's a retooled version of the Deep Sea Diver. The only Red Shadow vehicle I had as a kid was the Shadow Track, and I actually shared that with my younger brother. We both owned it. So we would have great fun kind of incorporating that into our play, playing in the backyard. The rockets that could, fly off it, I'm pretty sure we lost ours from playing with it.
The Red Vulture who drove the Shadow Track was a former getaway driver prior to joining the ranks of Baron Ironblood. As a figure, he was pretty close in appearance to the Red Shadow's army builder. Within the toys, the key difference was the color of the gloves, where the Red Vulture had black gloves while the Red Shadow's army builder had red gloves. That said, this isn't the case in the comics, as the Red Shadow's troopers would wear black gloves there. The enemy team's laser exterminator was a recolor of the 1982 G.I. Joe HAL, or Heavy Artillery Laser, and came packed in with the character of Red Laser, who himself is a recolor of the G.I. Joe Cobra Commander figure. Red Laser was a key member of Baron Ironblood's inner circle in the comics, being a laser technology specialist who was also an ex-member of a Japanese terrorist group. One key story of his in the comics is when the Red Shadows would assault an atoll, as it was the location of where one of Red Laser's relatives had buried some gold many years earlier. And the Red Shadows' attempt to recover this treasure put them at odds with Z-Force, who were already located in the area, unaware of the treasure's location, nor why their location was being attacked.
But when you look at some of the other characters in the line, Kraken is a fantastic character. Great little play feature, kind of having that stun net that came with the character. Always loved the creature from the Black Lagoon type, look to that character. In the comics universe, he was very menacing, very sinister.
The all-important codename Kraken storyline in the comics would see many of the Red Shadows lose their lives in the recovery of the creature during their North Pole expedition, but it did give Baron Ironblood yet another option in the fight against Action Force, once he was able to successfully clone the Kraken for use in battle.
And of course, the one character that I never had at all growing up was the Skeletron action figure. So that was one I always wanted. And now I have two Skeletron figures, which is brilliant, but I would have loved to have had even one when I was a kid growing up.
Before it was released, designer Bob Breakin had actually intended for the Skeletron to be named as the Robo Skull, and it was going to be the pilot of the eventual, iconic, skull-shaped vehicle. That said, when Bob presented all of this, there were others in the room who would make a change and decide that the vehicle would be named as the Robo Skull instead. The figure would then take on the name Skeletron, which additionally ended up becoming a mail-away figure option for kids. In the meantime, Bob was tasked with designing a different pilot altogether for his Robo Skull vehicle.
The Robo Skull, that was a holy grail for me as a kid. Never had a Robo Skull as a kid. I'm lucky enough that I have one now. But I feel, even to this day, it is the greatest action toy vehicle ever produced.
1984's Robo Skull is considered by many to be the pinnacle of the Action Force toy line, oftentimes the #1 piece sought after by collectors. That even extends to fans who grew up with G.I. Joe and not Action Force, even as the two lines would begin to converge and blend together over the years. The Robo Skull does have some easily losable parts and is highly valued when found complete. It has the ability to store several figures, including a pilot and a gunner, plus room for a captured Action Force hero on the underside. The eventual pilot, who went by the name of Red Wolf, was a former friend that later became a rival of Space Force's Moondancer, and Moondancer himself would go on to pilot the Triad Fighter. Intuitively, this could make for some great battles in space between the Robo Skull and the Triad Fighter, in similar fashion to the Star Wars battles between the X-Wing and the TIE Fighter. The Red Jackal, as can be seen, is a slight recolor of G.I. Joe's Destro, with his hyena vehicle being a red recolor of the Cobra, his tank. That said, Red Jackal is an altogether different character from Destro and has quite the tragic story in the comics. Unlike many others amongst the Red Shadows whose names are either top secret or unknown, the Red Jackal is known to be Anton Nabokov. Initially, he'd joined the Soviet military and his skills were eventually noticed by Action Force, where he joined their Z-Force ranks. However, he was nearly killed and wasn't expected to live after a confrontation with the Red Shadows. Left for dead, the Red Shadows recovered his body, and Baron Ironblood had his medical teams use unknown laser and bioelectronic surgery on him. Ultimately, they gave the now former Action Force soldier bionic body parts, turning him into a cyborg of sorts who now served the Red Shadows. Lastly, within the Red Shadows range, we have the Escape Armor, which is a recolor of the G.I. Joe Cobra Snake Armor. Its usage was to literally facilitate the escape of one of the villains, be it Baron Ironblood or another Red Shadows member, since it was highly impervious and could withstand a ton of firepower from Action Force while transporting its inhabitant to safety. And as the toy line would enter into 1985, it's worth mentioning as well that later versions of the Robo Skull would be packed in with the G.I. Joe Wild Weasel character, standing in for Red Wolf rather than the previous 5 points of articulation version. That and the Hyena would receive a black recolor and be packed in with the Hyena driver, which was the Cobra Hiss tank driver from the G.I. Joe range. All of this was done as Palitoy had transitioned away from internal design to incorporate more G.I. Joe product. And as much as we've discussed the story of the Red Shadows already here, the downfall of the Red Shadows and their transition to becoming Cobra within the Action Force comic universe is definitely worth a discussion.
And of course you have the story World Enemy Number 1. Baron Ironblood launches a whole series of terrorist attacks and captures hostages, again to hold them to ransom, and the promise is that they'll be released after the ransom is paid. But of course he executes all of the hostages after receiving the ransom from the United Nations. Baron Ironblood decides he needs to kind of reinvent himself, reinvent his organisation, and he essentially betrays the Red Shadows. The Red Shadow organisation is effectively wiped out. One character, Red Jackal, he realises that the betrayer is actually Baron Ironblood, so he sets about on a mission to hunt Ironblood down and get his revenge. When he ultimately tracks him down, he's confronted with Ironblood's new identity, which is he's reinvented himself as Cobra Commander. And he goes to attack Cobra Commander to kill him, and he says, "I'm going to destroy you," but as he's saying the word destroy, before he can get the word out, he's sprayed in the face with acid, and Cobra Commander in that moment decides to rename him as Destro, which is essentially mocking him in his failed attempt to destroy Cobra Commander. Destro doesn't even want to be in Cobra, but he's press ganged into the organisation, and he's Cobra Commander's whipping boy. So in the Action Force universe, our Destro is nothing like the Destro in the G.I. Joe universe. He's not an arms dealer, he doesn't have an organisation, he has no power. He's just simply a lackey who does what he's told and who hates Cobra Commander, hates him with a passion.
Others like the Black Major and Red Laser would get together with some remnant Red Shadows forces and find themselves in battle not only with Action Force but also with the new Cobra threat. That said, things don't always go as planned, and what was left of the Red Shadows would get wiped out, marking their end as a fighting force in the Action Force storyline. As things would change business-wise, the Action Force comic would eventually leave IPC and head over to Marvel UK later in the decade, where by this point, Marvel UK's sales had shot up considerably. Sadly for the Action Force brand as a whole, Palitoy's design department was closed down in August of 1984. And by 1985, the name Palitoy was no more, as parent company General Mills decided to divest itself of its toy group, of which Palitoy was included. Action Force and other brands would find their way over to Hasbro. That said, many would continue to remember what Palitoy and Action Force brought to children's sandboxes in years past. In the years that followed, the name Palitoy would live on in the hearts and minds of collectors, and former Palitoy designers like Bob Breakin would make themselves available to meet with fans and offer his memories and insights so that the legacy of what was built before could live on.
Bob Breakin is someone who I was really lucky enough to work with on the design of his book, My Palitoy Story. He's a true gentleman and a brilliant designer. There's a whole host of people there at Palitoy. They were really, really passionate about the work that they did. All that hard work and all that passion has paid off, because today those toys are still loved and still sought after by collectors, and even new fans. People are discovering the likes of Action Force or Action Man, and that's a testament to the great work of Bob and his design team.
The early part of the 2020s would see a modern re-emergence of the Red Shadows, centered around the Roboskull Mark II, which in every way is a love letter to the masterful original Roboskull of 1984. Founded by fellow fans of the original Red Shadows and utilizing the name Skeletron as their company name, it seems that fans all around have embraced the work that they are doing. It's been great to see the company grow and to get the chance to meet the individuals behind it at various events, because, like the rest of us, they'd love nothing more than to see the Red Shadows name continue to live on.
The Skeletron, the team there, the products they're putting out, these guys are a great team of creative individuals and passionate individuals who have a real love for vintage Palitoy and a real appreciation for the work that Bob and his team produced back in the 80s. Even though their products have kind of a modern feel, you've got the modern articulation, there's a real appreciation of the classic aesthetic, both in terms of the toys, but also in terms of the mythology that Palitoy and IPC created. I think there's huge respect there for that. So I'm a massive fan of what Skeletron are doing. And as I say, the team, they're super cool guys, really passionate, very creative, and excellent at what they do.
In the end, whether you grew up with the Red Shadows or came into them as adult-aged collectors, there's really a lot to like. As we've shown here, there's the pure fun in the collectability aspect for the amazing range of toys, and there's the enjoyable pastime of reading the stories that tell you about their adventures. Perhaps you got your first Red Shadows toy recently, or maybe you've had them all along, or maybe you're just thinking about getting started. Perhaps you're among those fortunate enough to have the old IPC published comics, or maybe you explored the option of reading about them in the Total Toy Books Treasury Edition series. In any case, there's plenty here to leave a lasting impression.
The legacy of the Red Shadows is really quite simply, they are the best bad guys ever, both in terms of visual look and also their backstory. You look at what Skeletron, how they've been influenced by it, you look at the homages by Fresh Monkey Fiction, and even their legacy in comics. The Devil's Due comics and IDW both incorporated the Red Shadows into their G.I. Joe mythology, as did the G.I. Joe Collectors Club with their own box set. It really is an iconic design. So I think the greatest legacy of the Red Shadows really is the result of the incredible work by Bob Breakin and his design team.
And if you happen to like this video, don't go anywhere just yet. I'm gonna put another Red Shadows related video that you can click on right over here, or to choose your own history topic from an existing playlist, you can click on that playlist right over here. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time. Take care.